Welcome back. We're going to do part 2 of our notes in Unit 8 on the section entitled No End in Sight. So when we left off last time, we talked about the Battle of Antietam, and Abraham Lincoln fires his General McClellan after that, even though it's a Union victory. Lincoln also uses the win at Antietam towards the end of 1862 to also prepare for something that's going to happen on the first of the year in 1863, and that's the Emancipation Proclamation. So the Emancipation Proclamation is an executive order given by President Lincoln, so it doesn't have to pass Congress or anything. It's just an executive order. And basically what he does is he orders the freeing of all slaves in the Confederate States. Now, this is probably one of the most confused parts of the Civil War, because it sounds like, oh my gosh, Abraham Lincoln just freed the slaves in the entire country. But you have to look at those words really carefully. He's ordering the freeing of all slaves in the Confederate States. So when you think about this, the Confederate States are not going to listen to anything that President Lincoln asked them to do anyway. So if you're in Mississippi or Alabama or South Carolina, you're not going to automatically free your slaves just because the President of the United States, which is the country that you're at war with, is asking you to do that. So technically, this does not automatically free slaves, but what does help is that as the Union troops advance in the South, if they come to a plantation, for example, they then free all the slaves at that plantation. The slaves are then free. Most of them go up to the north to the free states, and then that hurts the economy of the South because they don't have any way to generate an economy if their slaves are now leaving and basically fleeing to the Union states. Interestingly, also Missouri, for example, Missouri is part of the United States because they never joined the Confederacy. They do have slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation does not impact slaves in Missouri. So this is where things get really crazy because Missouri is part of the Union. The president has ordered the freeing of slaves in the Confederate States, but not in Missouri. Okay. Now, we talked a little bit earlier in the notes, this unit, or this particular unit on the Civil War, that African Americans were not allowed to enlist in the Army at the beginning of the war. Lincoln then changes his policy later on. By the end of the war, they estimate about 180,000 African American soldiers did end up serving in the Union Army. Some of those were slaves that were freed because of the Emancipation Proclamation. We also had free blacks in the Union states that did this. But there's a considerable amount of soldiers in the Union Army that are African American. Probably the most famous is the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. It's one of the first all-black regiments for the Union. There are some other ones. There's actually one out here in Kansas as well. If you have time, a good movie to look up, and I believe it's on Netflix if you look on Netflix right now, or you might be able to find enough of it on YouTube as well. But it's the movie Glory. It was made in 1989. It's a pretty famous movie. It won on several different Oscars and stuff like that. But it's a movie based on the 54th Massachusetts. We sometimes watch the educational version of it in class during the regular school year. But it's the 54th is famous for their attack on Fort Wagner in South Carolina. I won't tell you too much about it in case you want to watch it. I don't want to ruin the movie for you and give you a spoiler here. But the movie Glory is about the Massachusetts 54th. Pretty famous all-black regiment in the Civil War. And then here's a painting of kind of what that looked like when they attacked. All right, so by the end of 1863, the Confederate Army had lost almost half of its men, about 40% of its men. Both sides at this point, okay, so we've been fighting for about 2 years now, both sides are really beginning to question whether this war is worth it. It's costing a lot of money financially. It's costing a lot of men's lives. Both sides begin to kind of think about maybe it might be better if there was a peace treaty and then both sides were allowed to exist as a country. There were people in the North that also felt that this should happen. Primarily the Democrats in the North were the ones that wanted this. Lincoln was a Republican. The Democrats were the ones that kind of started to say, well, maybe we should allow the South to just be their own country. We should, sign a peace treaty. And those particular people, Democrats in the North that wanted to end the war, became known as copperheads. So a copperhead is a snake. Again, we talked about the anaconda a little bit earlier. A copperhead is kind of a shifty kind of snake. So people began to call the Democrats that wanted to end the war, if they didn't like them, they started calling them copperheads, kind of like that they were being kind of shifty and sneaky. What happens is the people that are being called the copperheads actually begin to embrace that name. And pennies at that time period in the mid 1800s were what they called copperheads. And there's a picture of one over here on the side. So this is a copperhead penny. People began to actually embrace the term copperhead, and they would cut out the figure that was on the copperhead penny, and then they would make it into either like a necklace or a pin that they would wear, and then people began wearing those with pride. Kind of like what happened with Yankees during the American Revolution. It was a derogatory term towards the colonists, and then they kind of embraced it and began calling themselves Yankees. So that's what a copperhead is. Now, at the beginning of the war, both sides asked men to enlist, so that was just their choice if they wanted to join the army. But as numbers begin to decline, both sides decide that they need more men and they have to do what's called conscription, what we would commonly call today the draft. Okay, so conscription means the government is requiring certain people to then serve in the military. Sometimes they take a list like the selective service list, and they just randomly pick so many people, and then they get enough people that they need until they can fill out the army. Both the Union and the Confederacy does have a draft in this particular war at this time. So what started off as just an enlistment situation does become an actual conscription or draft situation. Supply and food shortages start to occur in both the North and the South. Inflation hits the South especially hard. If a government just begins printing more and more money, there may be more money available, but the actual value of each dollar goes down. So during the war in the South, prices on some items go up 9,000%. So there might be a lot more money, but everybody then just raises the prices to then reflect that everybody has more money to spend. In 1861, the national government establishes the income tax, federal income tax. This is one way that they figure that they can begin to pay for the war. We obviously still have the income tax today. Many states, including Missouri, also have the income tax. We talked about that during our Constitution unit a little bit. But this was actually why they created the income tax, was to be able to help pay for the Civil War. In 1862, the government also begins to issue a new type of money. They're called greenbacks because they contain a type of green ink on the actual dollar. This is kind of a shift from what people had been doing. A lot of people depended mostly on actual gold and coin and things like that, silver. But now people begin to kind of like trust a little bit more in the government and actually issue paper money. There was paper money back even in colonial times, but this is really kind of a shift for people to begin to kind of rely more on paper currency instead of gold and silver. So you can kind of see a couple examples here. Typically, if we're in the classroom, I've got examples of different currency from both the Union and the Confederacy. This is actually a $1,000 Confederacy bill. States also had their own currency in many cases. Missouri printed their own currency, for example. And like I said, in the classroom, I've got a couple of examples of those. All right, so as the war goes on, we're getting into like year 2 here, almost year 3. Slaves begin to resist more in the South, refusing to work, breaking things on purpose so that plantations can't operate. Advancing troops are coming down from the Union side into the Confederacy. Because of the Emancipation Proclamation, they're also freeing slaves. So there's a lot of things kind of happening in the South as far as more resistance from slaves on the plantations. We haven't talked a lot about women's role in the war, but it was really important. Women helped as relief agencies, nurses, spies. There's some amazing stories about spies and women during the Civil War. In some cases in the cities, women took the places of the men that went off to fight in the war, and they were the ones that worked in the factories. So women were doing a lot of different things during the war as well. Maybe not in sheer numbers like, soldiers, but definitely providing a lot of support. One woman that really becomes well known after the Civil War is Clara Barton. Clara Barton was a nurse. She was a Union nurse. She helped with supplies. She was a nurse on the battlefield. After the war, she becomes very involved with the International Red Cross and actually starts the American Red Cross, which is still one of our largest relief agencies in the country today, and actually globally as well. Some of the other things she does after the war, she tracks down just thousands and thousands of families of soldiers that died in battle. There were records typically when a soldier would die, like on the battlefield, but their families might not get word of that until much, much later. And in some cases, they never really heard, like they just knew that their soldier was missing. And she spent like years tracking down families and writing to them and telling them what happened to their sons and where they were buried and things like that. During the war, when there's a battle and one side ends up surrendering, it is one of the rules of war that you don't kill soldiers from the opposing side that are surrendering. You take them as prisoners, and then you hold them in a prisoner of war camp until possibly they're traded with the other side for other soldiers, or eventually if the war ends, then they'd be returned back home to their side. So these are called POWs, prisoners of war. During the Civil War, because there were so many shortages of food and supplies and stuff, in a lot of cases, these POW camps were also not very well supported with food and the things that they needed to survive. So in many conditions, the POWs, if you surrendered and you got taken to a camp and you were being cared for by the other side, there was not a lot of food, poor shelter, there was lots of disease, overcrowding, lots of terrible things happened in POW camps during the Civil War. Probably the most notorious was called Andersonville. It was kind of in the southern part of Georgia. It was built to house about 10,000 soldiers. At one point, they had about 33,000 prisoners of war from the Union side in that Confederate POW camp. So things were horrible. Disease spread very, very quickly. So again, there's a lot of ways for these soldiers to die that is not necessarily being killed by a bullet. We've talked about disease already. We've talked about POW camps now. There's lots of things that are happening beyond just dying in the battlefield. They estimate about 50,000 soldiers died during the Civil War in POW camps. And this is a sketch from one of the people that was at Andersonville. After the war, they sketched out what it looked like so that people could get an idea. And this is what Andersonville POW camp looked like in Georgia. All right, so that's the end of Unit 8. This was Part 2 of No End in Sight. And we'll pick up and talk a little bit about as the war begins to gradually come to an end in our next section of notes. All right, thanks, guys.